With that in mind, and realizing that his fans would never accept what I could sufficiently prove on my own, I contacted an attorney just to make sure I'm interpreting all this correctly. Professor Nate Brody has over 15 years' experience in law enforcement, both as a criminal investigator and prosecutor in New York City. Now he teaches legal analysis and is a practicing defense attorney. Mr. Brody will explain whether any of inmate number 0645-2017's many convictions count as fraud.
This is not legal advice. If you need legal advice, please see a licensed professional in your area.
Hey, how you doing? My name is Nate, and today we're going to be looking at U.S. v. Hovind. It's a case out of Florida from 2008. Now, this is actually an appellate division case, so we're going to look at what happened on appeal after the defendants in this case were convicted. So the first thing is, I don't want you to be put off by my sunglasses. I actually have an eye condition that makes my eyes very, very sensitive to light, so I wear these glasses to help me deal with bright circumstances. And obviously, here it has to be a little bright because I'm actually recording. So that's why I'm going to be wearing shades. So let's look at the case. Here is the citation for the case, and if you'd like to follow along, you can read it with us. But I'm going to attempt to look at the documents, the court documents, and go over what actually happened in the case. We're going to look at the facts, we're going to look at the pleadings, and we're also going to look at the outcomes to see what actually happened. I'm going to also explain to you some of the concepts that come up in this case and see if I can help the audience have a better understanding of what actually happened in this case with Kent and Joe Hovind. And last but not least, we're going to be specifically looking at what Kent Hovind did, and we're not really going to be looking at Joe Hovind, but what we'll do is I'll be mentioning her name because as part of the story, but we're really going to be focusing on what Kent Hovind did and what he was convicted of. The court reports that defendants Kent and Joe Hovind were convicted, and they were convicted in the United States District Court of the Northern District of Florida, and they were convicted of failing to collect and pay employment withholding taxes, obstructing tax laws, and structuring cash transactions to avoid financial reporting requirements. And we'll go into exactly what all that is. And also, I'll be explaining to you some topics that also relate to it. What is cash structure, and what is employment withholding taxes, and those type of things. So within a legal case, you have to start with the facts because the facts drive exactly what happened and how if there were any violations of the law. So this is how the court describes the facts in this case. The court says the Hovinds owned and operated Creation Science Evangelism Enterprises, which sold videos and literature, provided a lecture service, and hosted live debates. Between 1999 and 2003, the Hovinds withdrew from AM South Bank over $1.5 million in increments less than $10,000 to avoid federal filing requirements. Company documents and records of the transactions established that Joe controlled the finances of Evangelism Enterprises and controlled most of the checks that were cashed. Now, Kent Hovind oversaw the payroll and related federal tax obligations, and Kent failed to withhold or pay quarterly federal withholding taxes or filed related tax documents with the Internal Revenue Service between 2001 and 2003. Now, the Hovinds were charged with a 58-count indictment and were convicted on all 58 counts. Now, this indictment was broken up into 3 parts. It was the first 12 counts of the indictment were for willfully failing to deduct and pay federal income taxes for employees of the Evangelism Enterprises. The next 45 counts of the indictment were for cash structuring to avoid financial reporting requirements. The last count of the indictment was Kent Hovind was charged with obstructing the administration of the Internal Revenue laws. So first, let's look at the first 12 counts of the indictment, which Mr. Hovind was convicted of. Now, the first 12 counts were for willfully failing to deduct and pay federal income and withholding taxes for employees of Evangelism Enterprises. So I want to now introduce you to a couple of concepts. First, payroll taxes. Now, we all pay payroll taxes if you work for a company. But what are payroll taxes? Well, let's understand it in this way. Companies that have employees generally must pay payroll taxes. Now, these taxes come directly out of the employee's paycheck. Now, you've probably heard of the term FICA, but FICA stands for the Federal Insurance Contributions Act. Now, some states also have similar income tax laws, but generally the way it works is that the employer pays a payroll tax for each employee. and the employee also pays a percentage of their income. So generally, it's the responsibility of the employer to deduct, withhold, and submit those funds that they collect from the employee and they pay themselves to the government. Now, tax fraud is simply a taxpayer, that could be an individual or a corporation, a taxpayer's intent to defraud the government by not paying taxes that the taxpayer knows are lawfully due. There's a couple of things there. Taxpayer must know they're lawfully due, and they must have an intent to defraud the government by not paying those taxes. Now, there's also a separate concept called tax evasion. And tax evasion usually entails a deliberate act of misrepresentation of taxable income to the IRS. Now, a common example of tax evasion is not declaring all of your income. I've got $2 million worth of income, but I only declare $1 million of it in my tax return. So that's what you're looking at. You're looking at someone trying to say they have less income, or they're trying to hide their income in some way to avoid paying those taxes. So how does this all relate to what happened in this particular case? Well, let's turn back to the court documents. So the court concluded that Kent was charged with the first 12 counts of the indictment for willfully failing to deduct and pay federal income tax withholdings for his employers for evangelism enterprises. The court says the government proved that Kent knew the tax laws required the collection and payment of the withholding taxes, but refused to comply. The witnesses the government produced were employees of evangelism enterprises, Kent Hovind's peers, and legal counsel. Now, these witnesses testified that Kent disputed the authority of the Internal Revenue Service based on the separation of church and state, debated the interpretation and application of the withholding requirements, and intentionally characterized evangelism enterprises as a church and its employees as missionaries to avoid tax obligations. Kent even opined to an attorney, David Gibbs, that he was smarter than other church officials who had forfeited real property after they refused to collect and pay withholding taxes. The jury found Kent Hovind guilty on all 12 counts, finding that he deliberately violated tax laws. For the first 12 counts of this indictment, which he was duly convicted, the jury found that not only did Kent know, because the witnesses testified, he disputed it and then refused to do it. But now, how did he go about hiding this from the government? So this is where cash structuring comes in. Now, the indictment charged Mr. Hovind with 45 counts of cash structuring, specifically structuring cash withdrawals to avoid financial reporting requirements. So what is cash structuring? Because obviously, this is not something that is in the common vernacular. We need to understand why cash transactions are important in this particular context. Now think about this. Most illegal activity occurs within cash transactions. Think about things like bribes, drug deals, prostitution. You're not swiping a credit card to pay for prostitutes or for your drugs. Generally, you're using cash. So cash itself is very hard to control, and it creates what they call an underground economy. In the 1970s and 80s, the government passed laws requiring financial institutions to report cash transactions that were $10,000 or more to the IRS. And the way they would do that is file these reports called CTRs, or cash transaction reports. The government also made it illegal to structure cash withdrawals or deposits under $10,000 in an attempt to avoid having your bank file these cash transaction reports. Now, these cash transaction reports were then turned over to the IRS to let them know that this type of activity was going on. Now, this was an attempt by the government to prevent money laundering and help the government keep track of large cash transactions, creating a paper trail for these transactions. Now, you understand that cash is virtually untraceable when it's within the economy. So this was a way to kind of track these large transactions as they move through the system. So here's an example of a common scheme in which you have cash structuring to avoid paying, let's say, payroll taxes. So let's say we have Company X and all of its employees are paid with cash to avoid payroll taxes. To avoid the bank filing a cash transaction report, Company X structures its cash withdrawals to under $10,000. See, what happens is if they took out $10,000 or more, then the bank would notify their IRS by filing a cash transaction report. So Company X withdraws $9,999, or it could be $9,000. Company X then pays all of its employees in cash. Now, doesn't pay their payroll taxes, and the company doesn't pay the payroll taxes. Because these transactions were made in cash under the $10,000 mark, it allows both the company and the employees to avoid detection. So what happened in this case? Well, here's the evidence that the government put forward, and this is directly from the opinion. The evidence established that Kent and Joe Hovind structured cash transactions with the knowledge and intent to avoid reporting those transactions to the government. Now, the government had witnesses. A former employee of Evangelism Enterprises, Brian Pomp, testified that Kent knew and complained of the bank reporting requirements, and that Joe, often at Kent's direction, regularly obtained cash to pay employees of the organization. Other employees and associates of Kent testified that the Hovinds openly disputed the validity of tax laws. Various documents established that Joe withdrew cash in increments of $9,500 or $9,600 from AM South Bank, as often as 4 to 5 times a month. Now, there was a total amount of 45 transactions between July 2001 and August 2002. Now, the jury specifically found that Kent and Joe Hovind knew about the reporting requirements and structured their cash transactions in an amount less than $10,000 to specifically prevent AM South Bank from reporting those cash transactions. And the jury convicted them on all 45 counts. The last count of the indictment was for Kent Hovind, and he was charged with obstructing the administration of the Internal Revenue laws. So overall, this case is a pretty simple case. What did the court find? Well, the court found that there was evidence sufficient to establish the defendants, Joe and Kent Hovind, willfully failed to collect and pay withholding taxes. The evidence was also sufficient to establish that the defendants structured cash transactions with the knowledge and the intent to avoid reporting those transactions. Evidence was also sufficient to establish that the defendants intended to impede the IRS agents in their efforts to investigate and prosecute their violations of tax laws. So it seems to be very clear. This was a scheme of, we don't want to pay payroll taxes, so we'll pay everybody in cash, and to avoid detection from the IRS, we'll take all of this money out in cash under $10,000. So the bank doesn't file the cash transaction report to the IRS, and no one will be the wiser.
Thank you, Professor. So the reason I referred to inmate number 0645-2017 as a convicted fraud is because he was, in fact, found guilty on every count of a 58-count indictment, where all but one of those verdicts actually does count as tax fraud, and where the last one was a failed attempt to avoid prosecution for defrauding the IRS. Now, look at how many lies we've already counted just in the first 10 minutes of the first of my opponent's 5 40-minute videos full of continuous distortions and distractions. It's only going to get worse. Won't this be fun? I should warn 0645-2017 that he ought to stay on topic, discussing one thing at a time like he said, but I already know he's going to bring up lots more topics to debate all at the same time and then blame me when he does.